Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I get asked fairly often, what's the difference between a poleaxe and a halberd? But then recently I also got asked a question, what's the functional difference between a halberd and a bill? And I figure I could make a short video about this. You don't get to look at my face this time, you can look at some nice pictures of the actual weapons that I'm talking about, which is probably far more interesting for you. So fundamentally the difference between a poleaxe and a halberd is not an awful lot. However, there is a difference, and there obviously is a way that we decide whether to call something a poleaxe or a halberd. One of those ways, and one of the ways that some people will tell you is the only difference between them, is the method of construction. These people will say, and I won't say that they're completely wrong at all, and there is a lot of truth to this in most cases, but they will say that a poleaxe is made of constituent parts which essentially assemble together in a certain way, much like examples that I'm showing here. Whereas a halberd is forged essentially as one piece that fits on the end of a pole. Now, I would assert that that's not a particularly useful way of defining the difference between a halberd and a poleaxe, because historically speaking we don't have that many surviving poleaxes to study, and it's entirely possible that some of the earlier poleaxes were actually constructed in a very similar way to a halberd. And in actual fact there's one fairly famous example of a poleaxe in the Wallace collection, which I've looked at on this channel with Toby Capwell, and it is kind of forged in one piece, and it's not really like a halberd. You wouldn't call it a halberd for various reasons that I'll talk about in a second, but it is nevertheless constructed similarly in that it is kind of welded into one lump that's then fixed onto a wooden shaft. How I would personally define the difference between a poleaxe and a halberd is that fundamentally a halberd is an object which, yes, it does have an axe and it does have something on the back, a spike or a fluke, and it does have a spike on the end, much like a poleaxe. However, halberds are primarily long-ish polearms, usually about 8 foot long or thereabouts, let's say 7 foot long, 8 foot long, and they're designed to be used by relatively lightly armoured infantry in units. Poleaxes, in contrast, are intended to be used primarily by armoured men as individual weapons of self-defence and offence. Therefore the shorter poleaxe, and many of them shown in period artwork, are as little as around 4 feet long. They really, range from what we would call a two-handed axe, even shorter than the Dane axes, so-called Dane axes that are shown on the Bayeux tapestry. We see poleaxes in art that are shorter than that, but they range up to about 6 foot tall, and maybe a little bit over that, a little bit over the height of a man. But really the poleaxe is an individual combat weapon. It has spikes usually on both ends, or very often on both ends. If it doesn't have a spike on the bottom end, it usually has some kind of shoe or metal fitting on the end of some sort. And it has obviously a spike on the top, and usually either an axe blade or a hammer blade, and very often either a spike or a hammer blade on the other side. So this is a weapon which is really specialised to fighting against armour in armour. Often it has handguards on the shaft, and it's a short weapon, so it's not designed for units of men to use against other units of men. It's a short weapon that's designed for an armoured man who can get in close easily because he is wearing armour, to use in close and be able to use in close. A halberd is not a weapon that you can use in close individually particularly well. It's at a disadvantage once you close distance on it, whereas a poleaxe is at an advantage at close distance. So the Matt Easton endorsed difference between a poleaxe and a halberd is fundamentally they are very, very similar weapons, almost the same weapon, that really are divided between a weapon that's intended for using at distance by a large body of people, by a large body of men usually, in contrast to a weapon that's designed to be used by individuals, fighting as individuals, in close range, in armour, against armour. So that's how I would personally define the difference between a poleaxe and a halberd. Obviously there are caveats to that, there are exceptions, there are weapons that we're not really sure. If you look in historical artwork, there are weapons we don't really know whether we would call them a poleaxe or a halberd, could be one or the other. As far back as the 13th century we see the ancestors of the famous 15th century poleaxes and halberds that everyone knows what they look like. In the 13th century they were the ancestors of these weapons, and they did share characteristics of both, and it's difficult to know whether to call them a halberd or a poleaxe, and that's really a subjective matter. In terms of the difference between the bill and the halberd, there isn't a huge amount of difference, but obviously they accentuate different features. The bill's primary feature that is characterised by its name is the hook, the bill hook. It has an inward curving or concave edge that it can cut with, and of course a curved edge in that form can be used to hook as well. Could be used to hook people off horses, for example, or to hook the horses themselves, their legs, or to tangle up people's legs and arms and try and pull people off balance, or indeed to open up things like shield walls or pull people's shields forward, or indeed to hook other people's pole weapons. So hook-like extensions on a polearm can be used in a great number of ways, and obviously if they're edged on the inside they can be used to hack as well, much like an axe blade. So fundamentally a bill can be used to chop, to hook and to thrust with the end, and these are features that the halberd can also do. A halberd has an axe blade on one side, a spike or hook on the back side of that, and a spike on the end. So therefore it can do similar things to the bill, but just to varying strengths. It can probably chop slightly better than the average bill, but the bill can hook slightly better than the average halberd. There we go guys, I hope that's helpful. I'm sure I'll talk a lot more about these topics in more detail in the future. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.